Hey everyone, and welcome to the 22nd episode of Facts on the Ground. My name is Misty Winston, and I am joined as always by my co-host Jesse Zerowell. I'm very excited because today we have one of my favorite journalists on the show. He is the managing editor of Shadowproof, and he has been doing excellent work on covering the Julian Assange trial in a time when not many people are doing so. So I'm very excited to welcome journalist Kevin Gosztola to the show. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. It's an honor, if I may say so. Let me start with this question. How did you come to focus most of your journalistic work on Julian Assange? I know that you started with covering Chelsea Manning's case, and it seems like your work grew from there to covering Assange and WikiLeaks. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I am not a professionally trained journalist. I decided to do it while I was in college. I was writing about activism that was happening on and off campus. I'm from Chicago. I was actually going to a school. I'm not from Chicago originally, but I lived in Chicago, and I was going to a school that's actually in the downtown area. So we didn't really have a campus. So the campus was basically the city, and there's constantly protests happening in the city of Chicago. And so I was covering things. And this was during the Iraq War was still raging. It was in its final years, I would say, as far as protest actions against it. And I was writing about groups that were doing mobilizing, and then WikiLeaks happened, or Chelsea Manning provided the materials. And after I had graduated, I was reporting on the documents that many of us now know as the biggest publications that WikiLeaks ever put out, and the most impactful, I would argue. And then from there, a lot of my work just flowed out of that. And I had the opportunity, which was really nice, to be able to work under someone as an intern at The Nation magazine in New York. And they're pretty respectable and actually on the right side of a lot of issues, as far as, they're part of the progressive media establishment, I would say, but they actually do stick their neck out for some issues, and they have done, and they've let me write about Julian Assange in the past, and there's other things involving foreign policy and other matters that they've done pretty good work on. So there I was following WikiLeaks, and 2011 was an incredible year for WikiLeaks. And then following that, I've just kept on it closely, doing Chelsea Manning's court-martial. And I figured that, I had followed Julian Assange's case, but I never found it to be as dire and urgent of a matter as defending Chelsea Manning, because she was in prison and she seemed so much more vulnerable than Julian Assange. And there were suicide attempts that were happening. And it just seemed very necessary to stay on top of what she was going through. And she's also a transgender person. So there's a lot of oppression that comes with being that, especially in any prison, whether it's military or a federal or a state facility. So I stayed on top of that while Julian was still in the embassy. And, I'll confess that I didn't give it as much attention as I probably should have until April 2019 came around and we saw him expelled and arrested. And then it was like, all right, this is where the focus needs to be. This is serious. But yeah, I'd say that a lot of us probably believe that this case was that the U.S. government had moved on from going after Julian Assange. But we didn't see an indictment when President Barack Obama was in office, and that may surprise some of us because they came after Chelsea Manning so aggressively, and they didn't like Julian Assange. And then because Donald Trump was outspoken about liking the Clinton campaign emails and everything from WikiLeaks, I think we thought that he might get a pass, even if he didn't like whistleblowers or leakers. We thought maybe it was possible he'd just get to live in the embassy for another 4 years. So definitely, once he got expelled, I was like, got to focus on this. This is the number one thing. But my beat has been whistleblowers and leaking and government secrecy and looking and the human side. But also, I like to go beyond just what we could call partisan whistleblowing, which is like someone on my team has just exposed the government if you're a Republican. So, I'm going to champion the person who exposed Benghazi. Well, okay, fine. And then if you're the Democrats, it's, well, they just showed something terrible about Donald Trump involving a call around Ukraine. This is a whistleblower. We're going to support them. Well, fine. Okay. But, it serves your political party. But I like to go beyond and support the whistleblowers who are doing it at a greater risk to themselves because they don't really have that support from anybody in institutions. And I'm not saying it's a disqualifier. If somebody supports you and you can survive and not be have your life destroyed, I think that's to your credit. But the cases that I'm really interested in are people who end up going to prison for their truth telling and really don't have anybody in media often to defend them.
And I think that's really important because we've seen that so much over the past, especially throughout the Trump presidency. There was the whistleblower who came out, and you saw a lot of the Democrats and even progressives who were championing this whistleblower, and we need to protect this whistleblower. And they never breathe a word about Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden. So that kind of partisan divide is really unfortunate. So, I mean, I'm grateful to you and for your work. I first started following your work actually with the Chelsea Manning case. I can actually remember you giving interviews like in your car outside of the building, trying to discuss what was going on inside. And even back then, I can remember you talking about, and others talking about how that there wasn't a lot of coverage of such a massive trial. And we're seeing the exact same thing now with Julian Assange. Jesse and I were talking earlier today. This is a historic court case on press freedom, and mainstream media hasn't breathed a word of it. Can you kind of speak on that and sort of the environment in the media landscape today and why this is such a problem that we're facing?
To me, I think that I try to hold two viewpoints about the way that the media has approached Julian Assange's case. On one hand, I see what everyone sees, which is that they're not covering the case, and then you have to naturally ask the question, why don't they want to give it attention? And I don't want to get into a discussion about, okay, so they're covering these stories instead of Julian Assange, and they shouldn't spend so much time on these stories. I think it's better to think of it in the more positive sense of like, okay, they really just don't see the urgency that we see with Julian Assange. So it's not like they're covering something else necessarily and not making time for updates on Julian Assange. It's just that they don't feel that it's going to affect them. And I think they believe that because of how they work with the government, that they're never going to get in trouble like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, even though if you pay attention to the trial, the extradition trial, what it does is it exposes a lot of the myths, and it unravels a lot of the myths around the way WikiLeaks handled the publications. I mean, I think if you didn't follow the trial, then you believe that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks got the documents and just dumped them on their website and didn't do anything with them at all. And the word that we usually use is curate, that they didn't prepare them for people, but they were working in partnerships with media organizations. They're not really reporters. That doesn't mean they're not doing journalism, but they needed to involve media from those different countries in order to make sure they had the impact that they wanted. So the Iraq war logs are a good example. We just had the 10th anniversary, and there were at least a half dozen, if not more, organizations that worked on those. The Guardian, Le Monde, Al Jazeera, English was involved, Channel 4 News in the UK, BBC Radio, I want to say, did some reporting. And they also had a project called Iraq Body Count that used these. And through their work, they were able to expose there were 15,000 civilian deaths in the Iraq War that were previously unknown. They exposed torture. They exposed horrific deaths and shootings that were happening at military checkpoints, where you have soldiers, young men and women who I don't think it's necessarily inappropriate that they're afraid because of the position that they were put in and what they were told about the people they're supposed to hate and fear. But they get there and they can't see through the sunlight, or they've got glares and they believe that someone's not stopping and they must be a militant or a terrorist, and they're coming through because they didn't respond to their confusing hand signals, and there would be horrific deaths that happened at these checkpoints. And we've seen them dramatized in television and film in the last couple of decades. Now, I also think that when we talk about the media, we should view in a positive light, or we should see it as a opportunity, because I got together people who were independent primarily and held a panel a couple days after the trial had wrapped, and I wanted to get them together and say, these are reporters who, like myself, had done the work to get credentialed by the court. They jumped through hoops in order to do their reporting. Some of them went to a room in the courthouse and sat there, and they were watching a video feed on a very tiny little television screen inside there, a cold room that it wasn't great conditions for reporting. I can tell you that the conditions were much better at the military base where we covered Chelsea Manning. And so you have people.
Where was that again?
That was at Fort Meade in Maryland, which is just about an hour's drive outside of DC. Okay. And Fort Meade is also really close to the headquarters for the NSA. And so we were there. In fact, they have an NSA museum on base. We used to have jokes about it because, and the time that we had this trial was the same time that Edward Snowden. About the same time that Edward Snowden came out as a whistleblower. So I think that what we should do, though, rather than spending too much time, spend some time, but don't spend too much time trying to convince corporate press that this is important. We should also make space for elevating reporters that are doing this work, which, to your credit, you're doing with me by having me on this show. But I think it's up to us to share reporting, because I believe that we should critique the media, but we also need to make sure people still get the information that they're not getting from the media. So, it's not enough to just say CNN did a poor job of covering Julian Assange. Then we have to get people the information about what happened in the case that CNN decided to ignore. Then we have to tell them, then we have to stop being angry at the media, and we have to get people aware of what's going on and why this is something that they should pay attention, because it's likely, we had a little bit of a discussion, Misty, when we talked a while ago, but I think more people are uninformed and not sure about this case and don't have firmly held views. As the cliche would go, Twitter is not real life. On Twitter, everyone seems to have their mind made up about this case, and people who are liberals are mean and obnoxious about Julian Assange and really wish him death or want him to be harshly interrogated by the FBI, so he'll cough up secrets about Russiagate that I'm not sure he has, or that he has any interest in giving to the FBI. But that's their fantasy. And I don't think they represent all of people in the U.S. I think most people have either forgotten what Julian Assange did, or they never knew what he did, and we can still educate them on what it was that happened.
Yeah, I agree. And I can point to my parents as a case example of that. They had the opinion that most people had when WikiLeaks came on the scene, so to speak, and the collateral murder video came out. They had the opinion that he's a rapist and whatever they were trying to smear him with. But over the years, I've had discussions with them and have provided them factual information, not from any ideological perspective, but just to let them know this is what's happening, this is how crazy it is, and they changed their minds, sort of like Niles Melzer changed his mind once he saw the facts. So I think there is actually a large constituency of people out there who, if they had access to the information, they would change their minds. And both of my parents are conservative too, so it's not a
And to
again, it's
Kevin's
not a
point
partisan.
too, especially younger people. Sorry to interrupt you, Jesse.
Oh,
I'm
that's
sorry.
okay. That's okay.
But to Kevin's point too, especially younger people, the collateral murder and all of that stuff came out in what 2010. So
Mhm.
there are a lot of people who are now of voting age, or they're now in their 20s, who were children, and they don't know what that is or what happened. And because there's no coverage in the media, either they have no clue who Julian Assange is, or they have a very distorted picture of who he is. So that's, I think that, and I think that the younger generation is going to be more likely to be supportive of him, just based on, what we're seeing, in activism in general. But yeah, Jesse tells me all the time about his parents and how he's kind of, and I think that that's important. And I think it's important for people to realize it may not be just one conversation. You may have to talk to somebody a few times before they get it, because there's been a decade-long propaganda campaign, and that's a lot of smears to fight through. So that's kind of an impossible task, it feels like, but that's all you can do really, is just keep talking and telling people the truth and showing them the evidence. So yeah, that's a really good point that you made about people just don't know. They
Yeah.
just don't know. The media doesn't cover it, so they're clueless.
Yeah, I think access to accurate information is one of the main problems, for lack of a better word, in getting the polis, getting the people to understand what's happening, to understand what's actually happening, that this isn't the way it's been spun on mainstream media. This is a kidnap, this is a torture, this is a drum trial. It's insane when you really sit back and think about it, especially that it's happening in this day and age. So, but again, I do share some of your optimism, Kevin, that if we can get the information to people, they're receptive to it, and that's important. They can make decisions based on that information. So,
Well, I'm pretty sure that they would have that they would be receptive uh, in this time when a lot of people, across the board, regardless of their political affiliation, have lost total faith in the government to do anything for them. Either they ideologically they could be opposed to government in general and not want them in their lives. But then I also think that most of the population do want some kind of help or assistance and would like to see government do more, and they just won't rise to the task. And I think that alienates and makes people angry. And when you see who the government decides to serve and who they decide to abandon and not do anything for, and when you see some of the cruelty, and then I think it makes people receptive to these whistleblower stories and to journalists like Julian Assange who do actually do something. And I'll add on this thing about the media that there's always going to be tension. I think anytime we talk, we'll be able to have a debate about this. But my current position is that it might be better if the media isn't covering Julian Assange, because when they do, it's not factually true, and uh, it's not. I don't even want them to be sympathetic. I just want them to actually recognize what is going on in the case,
Right.
in a way that acknowledges what the U.S. government is doing to him. If they believe he deserves it, that's fine, but at least represent what is actually happening in the way that shows the U.S. government has put in the crosshairs a foreign publisher or a journalist who we've decided is, like, on par with some of, like, we put as many resources in going after him as we put after some of the, like, leading figures in ISIS and, members of Al Qaeda. It's ridiculous. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's ridiculous that, like, we see him as, like, the U.S. government does.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just saying that I think, if you look at the amount of resources that the government has put into going after him, it's on the same level as these figures that, could end up on a drone kill list.
Mm-hmm.
And if you put it that way, if you really talk about what the level of attention represents, then, you can almost turn it around in a way. Like, the conservative argument in support of Assange might be, why are we spending all this money and why are we doing all of this to go after Assange? He really doesn't represent that kind of a threat.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that leads to a pretty good conversation about why the government has to annihilate him, essentially, because he represents, core principles of freedom and liberty that go beyond what the government is able to accept and tolerate, because it means more access to government documents. It means that more populations control their futures and destinies. I mean, the rise of WikiLeaks was deeply intertwined in these aspirational uprisings that took place in the Arab Spring in the Middle East and Northern Africa. And then eventually, at some point, they were hijacked by extremist groups and they were suppressed by those governments and they got manipulated and misdirected. And we can see that with WikiLeaks and with those things, there's a similarity in the sense that those need to be some way disrupted so that people who have a lot of power don't have to deal with the outcome, the fact that they're influential and are able to determine what people do.
Well, and there's so many, like, just straight absurdities surrounding this case. The fact that he, was held, illegally detained in the Ecuadorian embassy. The fact that he's being held in Belmarsh with, terrorists. And, the fact that he was spied on by UC Global, and all of these things that I think, and especially, like you said, the conservative argument, when you show people how blatantly his human rights have been violated over and over and over again, I think a lot of people, just normal everyday people, are very sympathetic to that, because I think a lot of people recognize deep down that if they're doing that to him, they can do it to anybody, and they will. And the UC Global case, I don't know how closely you've been following that.
Yeah.
But I wanted to kind of get your opinion. How influential do you think that case will be, if at all, on the case in London? Do you think that that's going to have any bearing on the judge's decision, or do you think that is just a completely separate thing?
It's one thing I'll be looking for when I read the decision. I'd say that if I prioritize how to cover this when we get the decision on January 4th, I probably want to look and see what the judge has to say about the evidence related to this private security company that was spying on the Ecuador embassy with the support of U.S. intelligence. And I don't know if she's going to make any findings that she's very hesitant to do anything that involves drawing conclusions. But I want to know how she deals with the evidence that was brought forward. I would like to see how she handles the fact that there's a Spanish criminal case against this Spanish security company director, because like that to me,
correct?
Yeah, David Morales.
Yeah.
And I don't know where that case will be come January, but the behavior of the U.S. government in that case should factor into the way in which she handles the extradition request or the way she rules. Look, I presume that, and I think you probably both do, I presume that she's going to grant the extradition request for the United States. But that being said, I want to know how she reacts to the evidence that legally privileged materials were seized from Julian Assange and provided to the FBI in the United Kingdom, which happened. His attorney, Gareth Pierce, told the court about it on was the final day of proceedings that information was entered into the court record. We have evidence from the anonymous witnesses who used to be employees of the Spanish security company that detail the way in which lawyers were made priority targets. We know that doctors were targeted who met with Assange, and they were stealing confidential medical data about Julian Assange. Really, crazy things like one of the doctors left the embassy to go get lunch and came back and found her notes were missing. The embassy surveillance staff had taken them and were making a copy, and she was like, what did you do? And then where did they go? And then they reappeared, I think, at some point in the afternoon, like nothing had happened. But they were taken. There were people who were working security for the embassy who were scanning people's electronic devices and making copies. You've got dossiers of people who were visiting the embassy, journalists included. So you want to talk about war on journalism? I think that this is a profound development that happened in the war on WikiLeaks, because it shows that it's a war on journalism. I mean, it was about going after anyone who was talking to Julian Assange in the embassy and who was going to publish reports that could aid in building support for him and helping him get to freedom someplace in Ecuador where he could live and not have to suffer from being targeted by the United States anymore. So I'll be looking to see how she deals with this matter. And I think that that's going to be a crucial area in which you can see an appeal coming after if she ignores all of that evidence and decides to flout and disregard a lot of international law, the way in which countries all around the world agree that you shouldn't target a person's attorneys because they're supposed to be able to put on a defense and be able to do that privately.
Right.
And those kinds of things, I believe, matter because, what you're doing by spying on Assange and collecting all of that surveillance and everything that you get from that is all those surveillance records. We hear, it's hard for me to believe, but we hear from the assistant state attorney that they're going to try to make sure that doesn't get into any of the evidence that will be used against Julian Assange. I don't really know how you can guarantee that, because it would seem to me that they're going to be pulling information from many of the same databases. Like, the prosecutors are going to have access to the same information that the intelligence agencies have access to when putting together their case. It's why they're going after Julian Assange. So I don't know why they would tie their arms behind their back and not use everything that they had available. And so, you think about this information that they've collected and the fact that they're targeting Julian Assange, and you say there's no way he could have a fair trial because they've got everything and anything that is the weakness. They know all the weaknesses of the defense before they even get to trial. So they're able to create an airtight case that will guarantee conviction because they've been able to violate his privacy and do the spying. And that should mean that the extradition doesn't happen. And I mean, I'll just state this: regardless of what does or does not happen, if we claim to live in a civilized world, which many of us do, and if these people claim to represent Western democracies that are beacons of freedom and the rule of law, then they absolutely should not allow the extradition. And anything that happens afterwards would undermine anything they say. But I've been following since the extradition trial wrapped some of the pronouncements from the UK government about journalists and journalism and freedom of the press. It's been quite hilarious to watch them talk about things that, like, I'm not from there, I'm not British, but I now have a basic idea about what they're doing in the country that seems to mimic the way in which things have gone downhill in the United States. And I know that they've just been arguing over an overseas operations bill, which would mean that there's a statute of limitations for people who commit torture. So basically, if you're in if you're there and you want to, I mean, we do a pretty good job in the U.S. of making it so people can maim and injure and torture others while they're deployed in war zones. But the Brits are playing catch up, and anyone there in Scotland or England who wants to go join up and support their government should know that now when they get deployed, they're likely to be able to commit torture. And as long as they make it 5 or 6 years without anybody bringing a case, they're going to be able to just go, that went well. I can just keep going on about my life. Nobody's going to think any less of me. That's what they're setting up. And they're blocking Freedom of Information Act requests from foreign journalists, even though, it's always been that, like, I could ask for documents from the British government. And it just seems like they're going downhill. I felt like that when I was watching, I'll end my long comment here, but I felt like that when I was watching the trial, that it seemed like there are parts of Britain that are sliding backward in the same way that the United States has, because they even put a medical doctor on the stand who was talking about solitary confinement, which Julian Assange would definitely be put in if he was in prison here. And he was just like, well, Julian Assange is a resilient person and he would be able to handle it.
Yeah. It doesn't even border on farce. It's beyond farce. But speaking of torture, I wanted to ask you, since you've been covering Julian's hearing so closely, from what I understand, there was a witness who testified, I believe in his defense, a witness who was tortured by, I don't know if it was
the CIA.
The CIA.
Al-Masri.
He's Macedonian, I believe. Can you talk about that? Because that really didn't get any coverage. I think I only know of one journalist who mentioned it, and I think that's just like the collateral murder video. It's a fundamental aspect of what we're talking about here, what's being exposed. Can you talk about that witness?
Yeah, no, that to me was one of the more crucial moments of the extradition trial. Any story that I would tell about what unfolded, I would put Khalid al-Masri's testimony at the top as being impactful. And also, he did it at great sacrifice to himself. He was targeted by the CIA. And when he was, I'll briefly recap what happened to him so everyone who's listening knows. But what I'll say before I get to it is when he was finally allowed to leave the horrible detention facility that he was kept in, he was told by people connected to the CIA or in the CIA that if he went to anyone in the German government to complain, or if he went to the media, that there would be consequences. And that was recognized, actually. I'm not making this up. I'm actually not even saying this because Khalid al-Masri said it. It was in an inspector general's report that looked into the abuse that happened, because Khalid al-Masri was abducted or kidnapped. He was subject to rendition and endured torture and was brought to the salt pit in Afghanistan. And all of that happened because of mistaken identity. If that's what we were led to believe, that they had actually picked up the wrong person. He was in Macedonia. He was arbitrarily detained for a number of days. It wasn't clear why, but he was there on some kind of a holiday. He's actually a German citizen, and he was there on I think some kind of vacation, and he was kidnapped, and he left. And so then a CIA team came to take him. Then they kidnapped him, and we know from his recount that it was absolutely terrifying. They stripped him of all his clothing. They put him in a diaper. They put a tracksuit on over him. They put him in the airplane. They spread him out in the airplane so that he can't really relax at all. So he's in a stress position while he's being flown to the Afghanistan facility. I think the plane makes multiple stops on its way to its destination, and he's there, and he is interrogated and abused for several weeks before they finally admit, at least privately, that they must have the wrong individual, but they're not ready to release him yet. They don't really know what to do with Khalid al-Masri. So he then goes on a hunger strike because it's been so long and he has no idea what's happening to him. He hasn't been charged with a crime. He doesn't know why he's still in this facility. So on his hunger strike, they actually force feed him, which is another form of torture. And it's happened a lot to Guantanamo prisoners, or it did, especially during the final days of Barack Obama's administration. This was happening while these men were, still hopeful that they were going to be released and allowed to go back to their homes. Some of them were engaged in hunger striking and were force-fed very brutally. And so Khalid was put through that treatment. And then we find that he was told, okay, you're allowed to go home. And this was after, let's say, 4 or 5 months. And he went and was put on a plane. He was given a suitcase. He was basically reverse renditioned. He had no idea where he was going. And he was dropped off in Albania, which, if you're following along, that's not where he lives. Right. So he was dropped off there, and he was left all by himself there, and Albanian police found him. And, it was quite scary because he thought he was going to be killed by them. He didn't have any papers, so they don't know what he's doing. Why is this strange man just wandering in our country? Mm-hmm. Eventually, he did make it back to Germany safely, but he said that there's been suspicious circumstances that he's had to survive with, his children being approached by people who were suspicious, and he's had his car blocked in while he's been on the motorway, or he's had times when he thought others were intimidating and harassing him, that it's possible he could be followed by somebody affiliated with any of the Western intelligence agencies. Who knows? He's complained to the police, and they thought he was actually going psychotic and threatened to institutionalize him in a mental facility. So this is what he's gone through, and it took the European Court of Human Rights in 2012 to issue a ruling against Macedonia that awarded him damages, and they held Macedonia accountable for their role in his rendition, for turning him over to the CIA. There's been no justice or accountability for Khalid when it comes to what the U.S. government did, but that was a big deal. And then when WikiLeaks put out the diplomatic cables, we found that it was actually the U.S. government that was pressured, that pressured the German government to not prosecute any of the people. And very absurdly, they served warrants on members of the team, but they didn't actually serve it on the jurisdiction they were in the U.S. They went somewhere else with those warrants, so it didn't really make sense because that's not where they were living. And there was a journalist named John Getz, who is German from Der Spiegel, who worked with WikiLeaks, and he did a lot of work on Khaled al-Masri's case. And he spoke about how the cables helped him to understand what had been going on and the cover-up that had been taking place. So, to conclude, we have this trial, and at great risk, I think, to Khaled al-Masri, because there's still elements that he's trying to prove. He still hasn't fully exonerated himself. He still hasn't fully achieved justice for what happened to him. He made this sacrifice and stood up and told the judge that he is supportive of Julian Assange, and Julian Assange did something great for me by publishing these cables. And I don't think that, he didn't say I don't think he should be extradited, but by representing him in his defense, he was saying that Julian Assange exposed this criminality by the United States. And more generally, this is the most vivid example, in my view, of the kind of crime that occurred, that you can connect back to WikiLeaks, that shows the impact of them. But there's numerous examples of WikiLeaks exposing the torture, war crimes, murders, and misconduct by the U.S. government. And it's pretty easy to say that the reason why the U.S. government is very motivated in bringing him to trial is because they put them under a microscope. They put the U.S. government under the microscope. They expose the inner workings of how the U.S. engages with other countries around the world, and they can't do it in secret anymore. Everyone knows their tactics and what they're doing. So they're, when they say WikiLeaks exposed our sources and methods, I mean, that's true. They exposed the way in which you are trying to maintain your dominance over people in the world.
Yeah.
I definitely agree with you that was one of the most impactful statements, because and it also brought one of my favorite moments of the trial, which watching the prosecution get laughed at, well, not watching, but reading about the prosecution getting laughed at in the courtroom, that was pretty great. But just as somebody who is a fan of Julian Assange, who respects Julian Assange and the work that he's done, it was heartening. It made me feel better about the situation when Julian stood up to defend al-Masri being able to be heard in court, because there was an effort being made to keep that from happening, and Julian was not having that. And after already having been threatened with being kicked out of his own trial, he stood up in defense of him being able to speak. And he still didn't get to speak, but his statement was read in court, which, we'll take what we can get in the court of Vanessa Breitzer. But yeah, so I think that witness statement and also the medical testimony was incredibly difficult to listen to or read about. I keep saying listen to, but it's because I was listening to Steve and Andrew every morning read about it. Which, by the way, when you were on their early morning shows and you were all very tired, it was really funny. So thanks for doing that. It was really great.
Well, you should know that this is a really hard topic to talk about. Something slightly humorous for people to enjoy is that every time journalists. So I was on this remote access feed. I didn't go to London. I was in the U.S. So it was very early, like 3:30 in the morning, early, that we would check into court. And it took until the final days of the trial for me to realize that every time I did this and checked in with the court officer, that every single journalist could see me in the morning, like when I was up, and I just, I looked like I had just been kidnapped myself. I look like I mean, and it's so dark in my apartment in the morning at 3:30. I don't have the best lighting and very few windows, and so it's just looked like I was in a cave, in the mountains or something, and just, and and every day. So, I remember I talked to Juan Passarelli, great filmmaker
I
who's done a
love
lot of work.
one.
Yeah,
And,
we had him on the show not too long ago.
Yeah.
and he just said, "You should have seen your face, man. You just look like."
Well, I think anybody at 3:30 in the morning is probably going to look a little, hot messy.
I just had a good laugh. I liked that.
Yeah, that's pretty funny.
So with regard to things like that, how much of that do you think is intentional on the part of the US and the UK governments, these very obvious moves to block access, direct access to covering the trial from within the courtroom, to what you just described, not knowing that other people around the world were able to see you? How deliberate do you think that is on these governments' part to, I guess, ham-fist any kind of honest journalism or assessment of what's happening to Julian?
Well, yeah. So I think they were using some kind of a service similar to Zoom, where we would all be in a waiting room, and I didn't know that like it wasn't just one-on-one, and then we would all be brought into the courtroom feed, but we were really all of these journalists from around the world, mostly Europe and the US, but there were a few in Australia too, and then Stefania from Italy, Stefania Marizzi would join, and I think that they did some good things. They didn't. So it's important for me to admit, although I'm not giving them credit for this, because I think they should, in the interests of open justice, make it accessible. But I just want to be clear here. They didn't have to let me cover the trial from the United States and not be at the courthouse. They could have insisted that we all travel to the court. They did it the way that they chose to because of the pandemic that's been going on. And this whole trial, everything that we've been talking about this whole year with Julian Assange, was all disorganized and made difficult because the trial didn't happen in May. In fact, Julian Assange has spent 6 extra months in Belmarsh prison because of the pandemic, and because Judge Vanessa Baretzer has been particularly inhumane in the way that she's treated Julian Assange. He was denied bail when he made the request early in March and tried to get out of jail so that he wouldn't get sick, which prisons are absolutely terrible when it comes to viruses and diseases, and you're at the whim of whatever the guard will do for you. It wasn't until after we had the scare that the guards even were making a mask available to him if he wanted it to feel comfortable to protect himself. And I know,
and just to be clear, the scare that he's talking about here is one of the prosecution judges. Supposedly her husband to somebody who maybe might have been exposed to somebody who had COVID-19. And so Steve Poikonen and I personally think that they were just getting their asses kicked. And so they were looking for an excuse to get out of court for a couple of days to regroup. But that's just my opinion. But yeah, that's the scare that he's talking about, that, that there were masks required.
Yeah, and the whole first week, there wasn't anything in the courtroom that they did to stop the virus. And then, suddenly after, the prosecutor might have it, suddenly they're like moving everyone around and the judge taking it seriously. I mean, it's such a charade. It was so fake. It was like, now that somebody important that matters to this courtroom could be affected, then, we might do something. But like if it's the prosecutor, we should do everything we can. But if it's Julian Assange, he'll be all right. It's going to be just fine. Like, it'll all sort itself out. And then, we'll find out that he's in the infirmary and can't come to court one morning. So anyways, I think that, there are things that they didn't do for us, but there are things that they went ahead and did the court. And, I'd say that, like, so there was one day where I was actually locked out of court in the morning. And I tried to claim to them that I had been kept out because of a technical issue. And there was no way for me to prove it to anyone. And, I could have taken a screenshot of the I guess the feed, but we're not supposed to do that. So if I took a screenshot, I'm afraid that I'd have my credentials revoked, and they would tell me that I'm not supposed to, send them those things. So that was the day that Khalid al-Masri was supposed to testify. And I was afraid I was going to miss it. And I had to put I was lucky I had a lawyer who was in the UK who could help me. And I also was able to get, word back to the legal team, the defense legal team, and to other journalists that were in the courtroom. And they say, hey, Kevin's trying to get in to this feed. And we had breaks like multiple times. They wouldn't bring us in during break, so that they kept insisting that if you miss this cutoff time in the morning, then you won't be able to join until the afternoon. So you miss everything in the morning if something goes technically, malfunctions. And that's what I object to, and I think, actually journalists had it pretty well. I think it's the trial observers and the public that were abused more by this court. There were over 40 people, including Amnesty International and Reporters Without Borders. I'd include them, but they were lucky enough to have help from Assange supporters who gave them a seat in the courtroom. And Rebecca Vincent is really good on this, and they've done some of the best work as advocates for Julian Assange. But these people were denied, and politicians, there are parliamentarians from Germany that wanted to be there in the courtroom and were denied access. And the way they wanted to be able to access the court was remotely, just like me. They wanted to not have to travel to be able to just join, because, if this virus is in fact as deadly as a lot of officials have claimed, then you should be making it possible for me to join without there being like a limit. And also, they already cut the court capacity in half. Mm-hmm. So like, if I had traveled to London, I probably wouldn't have been able to get a seat to go in the courthouse. They probably would have told me I needed to go on a wait list and see if I could get in later on during the proceedings. I would have missed the first week of proceedings. So they didn't do anything to accommodate these people. And that's what I object to. I think that there's a lot when it comes to what they call open justice in the UK. I'm using their words. That's not really the way that I would talk about it in the United States, but they call it open justice. And, they didn't do everything that they could to give people access. And I think that it's clear why. I mean, they wanted to just go through the formality of completing the witnesses and get to it as quickly as possible. That's the way Vanessa Bretzer handled all of the witnesses, all of these statements and everything. Anything that was given to her, she's just like, oh, you don't have to read it to the people who are following court. Mm-hmm. I have it in front of me, and I'm a journalist. I want to hear the witness say what they came to this proceeding to put on the record, because I want to report it to all of you. And she's just like, well, they're here to answer questions and they're here for the prosecution to test whether their testimony is credible or not. And it's just like, well, then I don't really know why they're here. I don't know, I'm not going to know why the defense put them on the stand. I'm not going to know all of their background information. I'm not going to know who they are. I'm not going to know what their connection is to Julian Assange. And I'm just going to know that maybe it give the prosecution enough credit for parts of their case, because that's what the prosecutors mostly did, was needle these people and get them to admit that, every question that they asked any of these witnesses was about, how can you claim that it's unreasonable for us to bring this case, and like to pick at them on different small issues. So to me, like, that's the thing that was most infuriating, is that a lot of this just seemed like a formality rather than like, okay, we need to get this right. Take the time to get this right. If people want to give testimony, let's give people more time to testify. If Julian Assange wants to, if Julian Assange wants his lawyers to take more time to deal with the evidence, then let's have more time to deal with the evidence. I don't understand why she wouldn't do that, especially if she wants to protect against an appeal. Because, like, if she's not giving people their due process rights to manage this, to defend themselves, then it seems like it's going to backfire on her during an appeal if any of the judges think she wasn't fair to Julian Assange.
And you mentioned Juan Passarelli earlier, and I think I love Juan so much. He's one of my favorite humans. But I think about midway through week 2, he ran out of fucks. And he was like, just these amazing tweets. Seriously, if anybody wants a good laugh, go back and look at his tweets from about like midway through week 2 on, and he was just done. He was having no more of the nonsense, and it was fantastic. And, I think that you're right, though. I think that the, Reporters Without Borders, seeing the fact that these, kind of legal observers were being blocked from observing is really terrifying. Like, that's, it kind of made it clear. And I think people who have been following Julian Assange and the case and his whole ordeal, we knew that they were going to try to do this as discreetly as possible. But I think that that's what really drove that point home, that they had no intention. They're going to try to do this. I mean, they're doing it in broad daylight, out in the open, in a courtroom in London. But the quieter they can be about it and just kind of shove it under the rug, the better, because, they don't want people to have sympathy for Julian Assange. They don't want people to realize how heavily he's getting shafted, and us by proxy. So, I think that was one of the more terrifying aspects of the trial, is watching, these people get shut out of observing. And big ups to the Assange supporters who held spots for Reporters Without Borders, because without them, I don't know that there would have ever been a chance for any of those people to get in there. So huge. I mean, the Assange supporters in London are rock stars. And so huge thank you. I don't know, I'm sure Emmy had something to do with it, or I don't know, but huge thanks to them for making that happen. Seriously. But before, I know we're kind of running a little long on time.
Okay, you can ask a couple more.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to ask you, as we kind of wrap up, I wanted to kind of ask you, and I know I don't like to make predictions. I'm sure you don't like to make predictions. I know that we talked earlier, most likely he's going to be extradited. Do you think that there's a chance that we can stop this, reverse it, figure out a way to save him, and then also the future of press freedom? I mean, you're a journalist, so I'm always interested in what journalists have to say about this, because, I mean, this really is your livelihood. This is your job. This is what you do. So what do you think? Where do you see this going? I'm not asking you to make predictions, just what you're feeling. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I don't think anything's ever inevitable. And I don't think we should take it to be inevitable. I mean, I'm going to show my politics here, but I'll just take one of the more inspiring examples in the world in the past week, was seeing what Bolivians did in their country, and basically to give the government that was imposed on them by the United States through a coup 2 middle fingers, and say, we're going to stay the course. We're going to keep going with our project. We're the people, and we're going to stand up for our economic vision for our country. We're going to control our own resources. And I put that out there as an example because they were facing massacres. There were threats to people's lives. It didn't look like they were going to hold an election. but they mobilized and they were able to make the government hold an election, and everyone saw that nobody in that country supports them, and they left with their fascist tears, and that's the end of it. And I think, like, we can have a fascist tears moment when it comes to Julian Assange. We can see people have to admit defeat because everyone mobilizes and decides that they're not going to allow the US government to go down this road and bring this case. And so I'll just say that I expect a request that is authorizing. I expect the request to be authorized, but just because it's authorized doesn't mean it has to happen. At any time, the UK Foreign Office can say they're not going to go along with this. At any time, the US Justice Department, under Trump's second term, under a first term for Joe Biden, can say they're not going to do this anymore. We can make this an issue. There's been a slow movement, but the seed has been planted to make it an issue in Congress. I'm not here to talk about personalities, and this is no reflection of whether I support a certain person, but Tulsi Gabbard introduced legislation to support Julian Assange and to also oppose continuing with this prosecution. And there are others in the Congress who I think have signed on in support of that. And along with it, there's good movement in support of Edward Snowden. There's good movement to reform the Espionage Act and do something so that it's harder to bring these kinds of cases, or to make sure we don't ever go down this road when it comes to prosecuting journalists under the Espionage Act. And so I just say that this isn't optimism, but it's not pessimism either. It's just to say that we all are able to make choices, and if we do what's necessary, it's not guaranteed that the government is going to win and succeed in bringing Julian Assange to the United States. I do fear that if he's brought to the United States, he'll be lost at that point. Mm-hmm. That if he's put on trial in the U.S., it'll be a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Everything that we have said would happen will happen. And, for the most part, a lot that we said would happen has taken place in the last 10 years. He always said he was going to go in the embassy. He wanted to avoid extradition. And we thought that the Swedish sexual allegations were just a pretext in order to get him to Sweden so that he could be extradited. But, as it turns out, the UK actually is open to extraditing him. So they didn't need that extra step. And they worked out a way to get him. But, he always insisted that if he left that embassy, he was going to be arrested, and then he was going to immediately be extradited. And that happened. That was our conspiracy theory, and that happened. And people who were and people within the organization everyone in the media said that they were crazy. They were out of touch with reality. That's what happened. And so I think, in continuing to predict the future, if he's brought to the United States, he'll be gone. He's going to be convicted. He might even be forced into taking a plea deal and I wouldn't fault him if he did, although it'll be a bad precedent for journalism. It's not his fault. He now has Stella, his wife, and he has 2 kids, and he wants to know that he might be able to get out of prison and return to them, whether they go live in Australia. I assume they would go live in Australia, but he wants to be able to see them and not be in prison for 20, 30, or 40 years and to die in a prison facility in the United States, which is what the U.S. government, whether they admit it or not, is trying to do to him. And so, I think we can stop it. There are things that I'm going to do in my work to try to inform and make sure people are aware of why this shouldn't. There's a lot of hard work we have to do to dismantle mythology around Julian Assange, to attack narratives But there's also a lot of people we need to tune out and ignore, and just accept that they're not the ones that are going to, like, there are people out there who were exposed by the Podesta emails or the Clinton campaign emails who are just never going to shut the fuck up and leave it alone. But we need to just ignore them and accept that like ultimately I don't think they're going to be able to stop us from saving Julian Assange. And they're not really going to stop us either, I don't believe. I actually don't think they care whether he's extradited or not. They're just going to support like if he does end up in the United States, they're going to support the outcome. They're not going to do anything to stop it. But these people to me are the more annoying people because they just speak on this, but they don't really care about this case that much. They just, they're just doing it for their own followers, and they don't really care about it at all either way. And so we can do something. We can do something about this.
It's almost, for so many independent journalists, even at least going by Twitter, it's almost as if they see that respectable journalists are discussing Assange, or that he might be trending, and they feel like, oh well, I have to cover this for my brand or for more clicks or subscribers. And I think that's just something to be pointed out, how many of these so-called independent journalists have co-opted what's happening to Assange for their advantage, for whatever their enterprise is, and they don't know what's going on, and I don't think they really care or even realize the implications of what happens if Assange is essentially disappeared. I don't think they even get that if he is extradited here, he's going to be tried in a court in like the heart of the national security state in Virginia, and the jury's going to be made up of people who come from that national security state, and he doesn't. What chance does he stand against that? But that those details are never really touched on by people who claim to be independent journalists and cover Assange. They don't even get close to them, and it's sickening to see that sort of the way they co-opt it as to build their brand. Misty and I were talking about this before.
It's really depressing. It's just really depressing. And I think that, Jesse and I were talking earlier, there's been like a huge crackdown on censorship on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube. People's pages are getting taken down and all of this stuff. And this is a byproduct of what's happening to Julian Assange. This is exactly where this is headed. And so it's depressing when people don't recognize how serious this really is. And I often feel like I'm screaming into the void and nobody's listening to me. And I know that other people who support Assange feel the same way. But I do, and I'm usually not an optimistic person. I'm pretty pessimistic generally. I'm very cynical. But I have seen, and I think Kevin, you touched on this earlier, there is kind of this slow motion movement. It's building. Like I can feel it. I know we said that Twitter's not real life. You can't really change anybody's minds on Twitter, but I actually have. And maybe I haven't changed anybody's minds, but I know that people have said, I wasn't really paying attention. I kind of knew what was going on, but I saw you talking about it all the time, so I looked into it. And so it is possible to get people to, get on board and recognize how critical and crucial this issue is. I say this all the time. It doesn't matter if you want Medicare for all, if you want to end the wars, if you want $15 an hour, any of those issues, those things, you will never get those accomplished if you don't have the ability to disseminate legitimate information. If you don't have a free press where you can put out your ideas in a free and open way, there's no way you're going to be able to accomplish any of those other goals. So this, to me, is the front line of every other fight that we face. And I try not to be too overly dramatic about it, which I have a tendency to do, but that really is the crux of it. That's where it is. This is, to me, the most important issue on the table right now. So I'm really grateful to you for your incredible work. I know that it was difficult, and getting up early and dealing with all the technical crap and, just all of the shenanigans. So I'm incredibly grateful to you and every other journalist who covered this. It is crucial work. And so kudos to you for being there and for, making this an issue that you are, informing people about. Because, I mean, without you, and not just you, I'm not trying to kiss your ass here, but you and the other journalists, but we wouldn't know anything about this trial. I'm really grateful to you for your work on that. So do you want to tell people where they can find your work? Obviously, they're shadow proof. Is there anything else that you have going on right now?
Yeah, well, so let me just say that it's good to be appreciated. I think that, I'm not suffering any more. It doesn't even really come close to being a fraction of the kind of suffering that Julian Assange is going through as he takes on the U.S. and fights his extradition so knowing that I'm appreciated means that I'll get up every day and I'll keep doing this. So it's really nice to have all those people and to see that outpouring. And I'll just say, if anyone wants to message me or talk to me about my work, I'm always happy to engage with people and to also hear how people are, how I want to hear how people respond to the stuff that I'm writing, because that keeps me going. So I have a newsletter at Dissenter, dissenter.substack.com. And there's a free part and then there's an exclusive part. And it's only a few bucks a month to subscribe, but I send out stuff about whistleblowers and updates on WikiLeaks, and I use it to do a lot of this. And then I have a weekly show that I do called the Dissenter Weekly, and it is an update show that just does what I talked about in the beginning of this conversation, expanding our sense of what whistleblowing is, and also covering WikiLeaks because it's at the cross section of a lot of this right now. So yeah, thank you for. I also have a colleague named Rania Kalik, and we do a show together called Unauthorized Disclosure.
Yeah,
and
and we have a lot of fun together with that. She has her own. And I suppose I can't end the show without noting that this Putin head has been leering at me the entire show, Misty, and he looks like he got punched in the eye. So
those are the little eye holes. It's a mask. It's a Halloween mask.
Okay.
So there's like the little cut out things.
On my screen, it looks like a hologram of his head just floating in the back.
I was trying to get it to look like he was sitting on my shoulder, but I can't get it low enough. Because it's like, the little devil on your shoulder, or the little angel on your shoulder. Yeah. So he's cute, guys. Come on. He's cute.
He's got like a pouty lip thing going, and it's just, it's.
Well, it's from I don't know if you know the meme or I don't know if it's a GIF or whatever, where he's like winking. It's like, yeah, like that little thing with the little hearts around it. Yeah, I'll send it to you. It's funny. But yeah, I went to the Halloween store for my kid, and I ended up buying myself a Putin mask.
All right. Well, when you guys face censorship and YouTube tells you it's because you have a Putin mask
head
in the frame, yeah, that it scanned you and found it there. Well, let me know. I'll write that up as a story. It'll be hilarious. That would be the
best way ever. That would be the best way ever to be taken off of YouTube because of my floating Putin head. Oh, okay. Anyways,
Kevin,
thank you for having me. I really enjoyed talking.
Yeah.
Kevin, you're on Twitter as well. People can find you on Twitter.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, at Kevin Gosztola, my last name, first additional.
I know you're pretty active on there, and you post your pieces or links to your pieces.
Yeah.
So that's a good resource for anybody who wants to follow your work. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was, I think it was a very productive discussion, and again, we both really appreciate the work that you and other journalists like yourself are doing. It's invaluable. I think some of the most important work that can be done today. So again, it's been a pleasure to speak with you, and more power to you, and all solidarity.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye.